This is, frankly, one of the more complicated gospel readings. For one thing, Jesus speaks to who he truly is. That's always a pretty tricky lesson, at least the first time you hear it. And then the summary of that part is that he's not a prophet. He is not the second coming of Elijah, none of that. He is nothing less than the Christ, the Son of the living God. And the second thing about this reading is that Peter is the rock on which Christ built his church. This reading really isn't about the birth of the church. That would come later at Pentecost. But this is the day that Peter was told by Christ himself that he would most certainly play a pivotal role in the history of salvation. So both halves are worthy of our attention, so let's try to split our time right down the middle. For the part about Jesus, this actually touches upon a great piece of wisdom regarding, of all things, interpersonal communication. That's how to talk to people effectively. It's not easy. You can't be too emotional, you can't be too emotionless. You have to listen, but you have to occasionally talk. I mean, the list goes on, trust me. It's a very complicated class. Well, the most interesting part of that class, at least for me, was the chapter on the 12 barriers to communication. They say that there are 12 things you can do in the course of a conversation that will bring that conversation to a screeching halt. Some of those barriers are quite obvious, like yelling at someone. That's not real communication. A drill sergeant or a coach will yell at people, but they're doing that with a different goal in mind. I admit there is a place for yelling in life, but it is a stretch to call yelling interpersonal communication, person-to-person conversation. Sorry, that doesn't quite fit. Well, another barrier to communication is, frankly, what happened to Jesus, and it's called diagnosing. I'm not talking about what actual psychiatrists do. What they do is helpful and insightful. I'm referring to what happens when someone passively says in a conversation, "Oh, he's that way because of this thing in his past." Dismissively. He buys expensive clothes because he has low self-esteem about his body. Stuff like that. When you hear people talk about you in that way, doesn't your heart just sink? Don't you want to crawl under a rock when people dismiss or label you like that? Seriously, that is a barrier to communication. When people do that to another, we automatically put up this wall of defensiveness. And it's not our fault. It's built into us. It is a human thing. So if you're having a little trouble imagining what I'm talking about, a diagnosing was the worst conversation of a year of my life after college. I was visiting friends one night, and one of them sat me down and psychologically explained to me exactly why my relationship with Valerie in college didn't work out. Thank you to any of you cringing in solidarity with me. I assure you that conversation was every bit as obnoxious and awkward as you're probably imagining. It was almost as bad as the breakup itself. That's diagnosing. It's not helpful. It doesn't bring people together. This is what happened in the gospel. Oh, Jesus is doing this and that because he's the latest prophet. He'll do this thing and it'll run its course and everything will be fine. If we say that Jesus is this specific thing in this specific way, we can contain him on our terms. The problem with thinking that way is that Jesus is far more than those people were giving him credit for. They thought of him in specific familiar terms. Second coming of Elijah, John the Baptist, whatever. To explain everything is like drawing a circle of understanding around everything. But if that circle is going to be complete, it needs to be fairly small, because you can't have any leaks in your theory if you're claiming that you understand everything. And by putting Jesus in this little circle, they left out everything that didn't fit in their mode of thinking. And I can't emphasize this lesson enough to avoid that, because it applies to our relationship with God, each other, and our ideas. If we try too hard to diagnose or analyze something, again on our terms, we very often fail to understand the whole story. Peter understood that. Peter didn't feel the need to label Jesus as this or that. Jesus asks him, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter's answer boils down to, Jesus, you are who you are. There's no other way to properly describe you. You are Christ, the Son of the living God. And perhaps that's the reason that Jesus made Peter the rock on which he built his church. We don't really know that. Jesus never actually states in black and white why he picked Peter, but it is a very reasonable guess that Peter was the first of the disciples because he was able to see Jesus for who he really was. And I wonder how many of us here today are willing and able to do exactly that today, but through the lens of faith.